All right, welcome everyone to episode 25 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. And let's go ahead and just put right out there that it's been a minute since our last episode, right? In fact, our last episode aired on October 18th, and it was about the election. And it was actually, well, I won't go into the details, but we were talking about what was then the upcoming election. And of course, now here we are on the other side of that, which I'm sure will be a part of future conversations. I do want to say right up front as I begin to kind of scope for you all where we're going right now, how grateful I am for the folks who are joining me today, and I'm going to say joining me for the foreseeable future as we wrestle together with this next series of discussions that we're going to have in this podcast. Melissa Ellis, of course, who you all know well by now, is a high school friend who I reconnected with soon after starting this podcast. Little did she know when she joined me for one episode that I would start to low-key recruit her to be a constant voice alongside me. And she's been really gracious in doing exactly that. Henri Williams, you guys have met a couple of times. Henri is a member of my family who, like Melissa, agreed to join me for one episode. And then also, like Melissa, I quickly realized how much he brings to the table and what an asset he is as another informed voice to help inform our thinking along the way. So with that said, when they agreed to meet with me recently to help me flesh out my own thinking about where to go next with this podcast, there was no question that we knew we wanted to continue to maintain a laser focus on generating a conversation about race in this country, one that perhaps isn't tied to or even withstands news cycles, one that doesn't focus on any one event, but continues instead to force us to really peel away the layers from the eyes of the average American, if you will, so to speak, of how racism influences our daily lives, and importantly, how each of us responds to that influence. So to that end, in our conversation, we agreed it would be helpful to our own thinking and to help kind of scope our conversations, to deepen our own learning, et cetera, to center our conversations perhaps around a text. And you'll see that we've grabbed onto that, and we made the decision to start with the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. You all might be familiar with that piece of work and some others that he has written that are all very important. And honestly, last summer after the murder of George Floyd, Kendi was everywhere, right? You saw him everywhere on interviews, and really, folks were reaching out to him to help center their own thinking and understanding. So I think that's what drew me to his text back then, because then, which feels like a million years ago and really was only about 8 months, like a lot of people, and certainly I can only speak for myself, but a lot of the white people in my life, I was trying to consume as many books and podcasts and resources as I could to better understand how to be a part of the solution. And that's how we ended up with the podcast, these sessions that we had all last summer and last fall. And I guess what we want all of you listening to know is that in this moment, this podcast is working to serve the purpose of ensuring that the conversation doesn't quiet down like it is wont to do, that the work doesn't stop because we've lost our focus, which you could argue is easier to lose right now in the midst of a pandemic than ever before. So right up front, we're going to admit, for example, that like we don't have the street cred to bring Kendi here. So we're going to be talking about his work, but don't expect him to show up. Like that's not happening, right? So let me just put that right out there. This isn't a build up to a grand reveal. But instead, I really actually think what we're going to do is important, because instead we're going to work through his research, his ideas together, just like any of you would or could. And perhaps some of you have read this book. And we're going to share our struggles with understanding and highlight the pieces that we feel could be critical to you in your own journey. And how we do that is going to be organically developed, right? It could be chapter by chapter. It could be concept by concept as they come to us and they're developed, et cetera. So with that, I just want to kind of wrap up this bridging piece from our last episode by saying that a big part of our why is a belief in this idea that Kendi presents right out of the gate, and that is that we are all surrounded by racial inequity, and it's as visible as the law, and it's as hidden as our private thoughts. So to that end, we're going to start this journey, and we'll see kind of together where it takes us Episode 25 today is going to start with the basics, really digging in and clarifying terminology. These are concepts that we'll return to over and over again throughout our conversations. But the fact is, we know that if we're not clear about them right now, and clear about defining what we mean by them up front, then we will lose a lot in our upcoming conversation. So we have to be clear about them. And let's go ahead and put on the front end this idea that just even the simple act of defining and agreeing on the terms is really hard. It is impossible to separate your own experience, our own experiences and emotions from the words. So we simply ask you all as the listeners that to hear us. And when you feel like shutting down because you're in violent disagreement with something, to take this step back and perhaps take the step of doing your own reading. We're not here to convince anyone of anything as much as we're here to clarify each person's understanding of the role that they play in how racism exists in this country every single day. So that's our intention. If we can help you inform your own thinking, then we did what we set out to achieve. Lastly, by the way, I do want to say this, that there is a spectrum to this. So let's be clear. And we've said this, Melissa and I've said this before. We don't represent all people. I don't represent all white people. Melissa and Henri don't represent all people of color or Black people. But so what you're going to hear is our journey, right? We're starting with these definitions alone. Our journey, our understanding. There is no right or wrong way. There is only your way. So I think we're ready to kick off this hour, you two. And you've been sitting there patiently with me as I got through all of that. So thank you for that. So we're just going to put forth the hard words now, right? And I know, again, I struggle sometimes because sometimes it's like, they're just words, like how long do we spend on them? But the realization obviously is that these words are really critical. So we're going to start there. That the journey for us, of course, is these definitions alone are going to be our starting point. And we're acknowledging that words matter. So we're going to kick off. So I think you guys, and you know, behind the screens, we did plan this. We're going to start with the concepts of racist and anti-racist, right? Racism and anti-racism. So out of the gate, I know that word causes some strife, and we've had some, you know, planning conversations around this. So I'm going to be quiet now, and Henri and Melissa, ask you guys to jump in with your initial thinking about how Kenny defines these words and your kind of coming to terms with them, if you will.
I'll start, and I'll start because of the conversation we had in our planning session. I admitted during that session that the definition that he uses, the broad definition of racism, the idea that anybody and everybody is racist unless they are actively attempting to be anti-racist, was challenging for me. The reason it was challenging for me is because I've always followed the ideology that racism involved power, not just the power to hurt or the power to isolate, but the power to actually oppress in all areas of life. You know, the ability to deny jobs, the ability to deny just basic human rights. And so the idea that Black people could be racist is not something that I sit comfortably with, because I do not believe that, especially in this country, and I do know that anti-Blackness is a global issue, but just speaking from personal experience and speaking from life in America, I have not seen, let me say that, I have not seen Black people hold the power to oppress entire groups of people at any time or place. And so that made the idea of just everyone being racist or anti-racist, that strict Black and white definition, was difficult for me. It remains difficult for me. I don't want to give the impression that it's not still difficult for me. It remains difficult for me. I'm trying to be open to the idea that that it's broader than the power, which is still, I'll be honest, and I don't know that I'll ever get to that place.
Yeah.
But that was one of the reasons that I really wanted us to kind of touch on definition. As most of you know, and I know that Janice knows, I don't even know if Henri knows, I'm a poet. So I'm a socially conscious poet most of the time. Most of my work revolves around social justice and equality. And so words absolutely matter to me, and not only how we use the words, but the understanding of other people matters to me, because I'm a strong believer. You hear people say all the time, well, it's not my fault if you don't understand what I said, and I disagree with that. Communication stops if the person you're speaking to doesn't understand what it is you're trying to say. So if we don't have a shared understanding of the words and the definitions of those words, then we're not making any progress.
Yeah.
So I'm actually coming into this episode a student myself,
Sure.
and trying to learn and be open to the perspectives of other people when it comes to the definitions of these terms, and understanding that not everybody carries
Yeah,
that same definition that I carry.
absolutely. Henri, what are you thinking?
Well, no, and yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation because, after we met, I thought about this a lot, and so think of it. So I came to the idea of metaphor, and the idea of races being and think of it metaphorically, because what I did do, and Melissa, you kind of stroked this for me. I read forward, and as I read forward, what he begins to do is attach culture, race, other things to the definitions. And that's where I began to struggle, because, I said, oh yeah, well, I'm a racist. Well, no, I'm not a racist. What I am is someone who has adopted racist concepts and ideas that I've layered and included into my life. And so I get the definition. I clearly, on the definition, let's say globally, is sort of like you say, one who is supportive of ideas, concepts, policies that, for lack of a better word, separate people and, cause barriers for one versus other. Versus anti-racist, is one or ones who engage in actually activities, behaviors, changing of policies that will undo some of those harms, some of those barriers, start to level out the playing field. And I'll give you a great example. He starts to talk about culture. And as he's talking about culture, and because I lived in that era where we kind of went from Negro to Black, and that was very significant to me, the idea that I don't have to call myself Negro, or people stop calling me colored. I kind of, part of my life touched on that period too. To say it loud, do Black and you're proud, that's very significant, but as I think about that going forward, racism, anti-racism, and in spite of that, you still adopted things that clearly looked at the lens through white behavior and, beauty, hairstyles, makeup, and the whole idea of culture. And so I started to think, at what point do we separate? If I truly think of these as racist, developed cultural things, then being anti-racist means what? And in trying to achieve that, how do we do that? And I quickly went to this weird place, and I apologize to people because of the way my mind thinks. Is so if I want to honor truly my African culture, okay, I'm going to go to work next day with my dashiki on and my sandals and a hairstyle that maybe reflects the culture and we all know what's going to happen when I walk into the front door. And so this whole idea of anti-racism and coming to terms with how that's become part and parcel of our existence and our culture, and the undoing of that is complicated to me because I, for example, have the things that people adopted to, let's say, become more white. And undoing that, what does that mean to them, you know? And I guess I saw over time, like, okay, maybe some of those things were trying to fit in,
Right.
but over time, have they become part of your life in a different way, shape, or form? And what undoing that is going to mean, you know? And so I don't know if this is where you wanted to go with this, Janice, but you know, when I start to think about these definitions, I get it.
Yeah.
And I think for me, maybe the place I want to think about is, like we were saying, the policies, the systems, the structures, you know, that we all deal with almost every day. And how do they support, let's say, these racist beliefs?
Right.
And how do we then move forward to, let's say, undo some of this, which is not easy. And at times I'm thinking it's going to be complicated.
It's going to be, Henri, it's going to be incredibly complicated. And what I appreciate about how both of you started us off is you're being very transparent about the struggle, right? If we struggle as a group, just understanding and identifying those words, right? Those two words. And to your point, how complex that is, then in my mind, that just reinforces how important having these conversations will be.
And I think, Janice, also it just drives home why racism is such a hot button issue for everybody.
Yep.
Because it is so woven into the fabric of who we are as a culture, as a people, as a country, that even the people who are negatively impacted by the racism struggle with that idea of what racism is, because it is just an integral part of who we are, because it's the way we've been taught, it's the way we've been treated, it's the way we've been, that we live our lives. And so, as Henri was saying, and I know the listeners can't see me, but you guys could, I'm over here vigorously shaking my head yes, because it's hitting home for me how undoing all of this could very much challenge every single part of who I am as a person. What I see, and we, beauty pops out first because it's one of the most common ways, but what I view as beautiful, how I wear my hair, the clothing I choose to wear, something as small as that to someone else who can wake up in the morning and just throw a brush through her hair and think nothing of it when going to work. If you wake up, Janice, and you have a bad hair day, you throw it in a ponytail and you go to work. I don't have that luxury unless I'm wearing a wig or a weave and even down to that small detail of who I am on a daily basis is formed, not just impacted, but formed by racism in this country. And so I think that Henri's statement just drives home why this is such a hard issue to tackle, which just makes me prouder that we're doing it, prouder of the listeners who are trying to do it with us, and just hopefully drives home for everybody that it's a journey that we're on together. We're not saying that any of us have answers. We're not saying that we have this, we've mastered this, or we've conquered this, and now we're going to teach you how to be. Nah, we're not saying any of that. What we're saying is we're willing to work through it, and we hope that you'll join us on that journey. So I think, Henri, I think you're in the perfect spot. You said you don't know if that's where we wanted to go with things, but yeah, I think that's exactly where we have to start this conversation.
I mean, and just to throw this in, talk about irony. In 2 days, Black History Month starts.
Yeah.
You know, and 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 if this is part of the podcast for listeners' sake, I did not plan this. You know, there was no idea of, oh, geez, let's start this conversation in February to coincide with Black History Month, because some would see that as, oh, yeah, there you go, you know. And quite frankly, I always thought Black History Month should be every month, you know. It shouldn't be this marvelous in February, all of a sudden we start to think about these racist, anti-racist things, and we get all this spirit about what we're going to do and change. Well, what about the other 11 months of the year, you know? Yeah, it's just interesting in that way that I thought about that.
And let's be clear, you're right. We did not plan it that way for exactly the reason you just said. I think it's a bit of a shame to consider that there should be a month, right? That it's a month, right? But so yes, listeners, full disclosure, it wasn't intended that way. This isn't a gosh, let's do this kind of a thing. So listening to the two of you talk, there's a couple things that I want to raise. So and I love that our conversations every single time make me go, oh my gosh, that connection. Oh my gosh, that connection. So based on what you said, Melissa, I want to be clear. Yes, we're not here with all the answers. We're here to struggle along with you, right? Because when we're engaging in a struggle like this, the best thing you can have is a sense of a community who's with you on that, right? So let's be your community of strugglers, if you will. But listening to you both talk, what I realize is that there's an analogy or not an analogy, a connection for me to some work that I'm reading with my day job, right? And I'm an educator and I work for a company, an organization. We partner with districts across the country to redesign their systems. And so I read an article recently from the FSG organization, and it's an organization committed to social change, but it's called the Water Systems Change. And it's about the reason they call it the Water Systems Change is because it's an acknowledgement of all of the things that are in the water that we don't even see that influence our everyday moments. And in this case, they're talking about in organizations, but Melissa, you were talking about, and both of you touched on that you have to consider that everybody can behave in racist ways. If you believe that a part of how this country has been built is on a foundation of racist ideas, and that they're everywhere and we're not even thinking about them. And you guys, you pointed out some about, you know, how we look, how we dress, what we hold as a standard of beauty, for example, etc. But in this article, they have this image, right? And here's the quick little anecdote. A fish is swimming along one day when another fish comes up and says, "Hey, how's the water?" The first fish stares back blankly at the second fish and says, "What water?" And I was like, that's it. That's it, right? Like what racist? What are you talking about? Because it's so much a part of the fabric, right, of this country. So he says, so I want to take us really quickly, Kendi, basically, he defines racism as the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas. And we talked about this in our planning session that for me, that was important because he actually takes the person out of it, right? He doesn't say you're racist. He says you are behaving in a racist way when you support racist ideas and policies, when you allow them to exist without, Henri, you introduced us to anti-racist, without taking an active stance. So essentially what he's saying is that any moment of any day, when you're being influenced by racist ideas or racist policies, if you're not taking a stance against them, then you're conceding to living among them, and or you don't even see them, right? They're the water, you don't even see them. And so I think a part of his work here and a part of our conversations is helping open our eyes, right? Like it's easy to say we're surrounded by it. It's more challenging to really think through, what does that look like? And we've already thrown out a couple of ideas, like I said, you guys did this morning. Yeah.
So, as a thought, and I don't know if he touches on this so much, but when he talked about politics, I want to go back to policy, because it's our Congress who are making laws and decisions. And I've said, and I think he touches on this, or others have touched on this, we can't dismiss, and we've seen this in the insurrection January 6th, and who was involved in terms of Congress. You know, we can't dismiss that some of these folks have these ideas.
Sure.
And these are the people who are in position to make laws and decisions about us, you know. And I'll give you a very interesting idea. It's Rand Paul from Kentucky. They're talking about moving forward this bill to require a $15 minimum wage.
Okay.
And I'm quite sure any of us or anyone listening to this podcast, $15 minimum wage cuts across race, ethnicity, culture. I mean, I think everybody anywhere would appreciate $15 minimum wage. But where does he go to when he's responding to this? He talks about how this is going to harm Black teenagers and blah, blah, blah. So in a sense, he's playing the race card,
Right.
you know. Literally, here's a white man, you know, in Congress playing the race card, talking about, well, you know, if you do this, this is going to harm, you know, Black and brown people. So maybe we shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
You know, and as I'm listening to this, what a great example of promulgating or continuing racist ideas. If you believe it's going to harm everybody.
Yes.
I mean, if you really want to talk about harm and who's going to lose work or not lose work, why are you just focusing on Black people? What is your end game with that? And so to me, I'm just throwing that out as an example of how this is so embedded. And I'm quite sure some people will hear that and it'll just go over their head of, oh yeah, people are gonna get harmed.
Well, so here's what's important about that example, Henri. And we're going to get into this because later, as you said, right, as Kenny continues to develop his ideas, he's going to come back to specific examples. But in the beginning, he throws out examples from the 80s, for example, and the 90s. And you think of big, broad, sweeping presidential initiatives that were voted in. And we're not going to go into detail about those today. They'll be in future conversations. But it's easy to look back and go, oh my gosh, yes, now I can see how intentional that was about creating inequities, et cetera. You just gave a live example of it didn't just happen then, it's still happening. And so part of this, again, these conversations is opening our eyes. So let me really quickly, before we go further, I want to be clear because you brought up policy and I really appreciated that. What Kenny does is like, he says, here's a definition, right? And he says, but within that definition, let me define a couple of those words I use, because let's be clear about this. So you brought up policy, but you brought it up in terms of a high level where we elect people who then turn around and create laws and regulations. But he actually is explicit about defining policy as written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. So this is why that was important for me, because we're not just talking about policies in terms of things that are governmental or written down, but rather any formal or informal guidelines, spoken or simply understood, that govern people. So I clarify that, and then I want to hear your responses, because even the word policy can generate a sense of, oh, wait, you're going to talk about policy? I can't influence that. That's not my struggle. I'm done here. I don't have to do anything else, right? My struggle is over. So I want to be clear about the way he defines policy, that I'm absolutely hope that everyone will embrace, implies, of course, that we all have influence on racial policy given that definition, right? So when you think about your day-to-day life, the company you work for, the businesses you use, the services that you either use or you're providing, et cetera. Heck, I think about running my kids' PTO, right? Those are all examples of policies and regulations and guidelines that are written or unwritten that guide us, which means it's all our struggle. So I want to be clear about the word policy for folks so that no one dismisses it and then says, oh gosh, I don't have to worry about this. They're talking about the government. I don't have to worry about this. Anyway.
Well, just to quickly say this, and where anybody and everybody can participate, I go back to the idea of metaphor.
Yeah.
Policy. Boycott is policy. I mean, literally, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they got it, boycott, mass, boycotts was policy.
Yeah.
Because what is the end game? To hopefully affect a change in how things are going to affect people.
Yeah.
So we all have an opportunity to participate. It's just where and how you want to do that.
Yeah. In fact, now that you say that, I would argue it would be interesting for our listeners, right? If you are at all wavering about your place in this struggle, sit down and evaluate the last week, right? Look at your calendar and all the different events that you were a part of, again, personal, professional, get-togethers virtually, whatever it was, and ask yourself, what were the written or unwritten guidelines that we interacted around, right? That's how I think you understand moment by moment your place in it, right? Your place in the struggle, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think a very important way that can be done, Janice. I love the idea of looking at your week, but I would also say look at your bank account, because we're talking very heavily about the unintentional or the ingrained way that racism impacts us, or that we've lived by these things all our lives. But I also don't want to take away from the fact that there have been very deliberate attempts to keep Black people specifically, because I'm speaking of my own experience, but people of color in general. But there have been very specific actions taken to make sure that Black people don't have equality. One of them is to ensure that we stay mainly in a state of poverty. And so people will see that, oh, a famous Black person or a few famous Black people have reached wealth, but they don't think about the fact that there have been deliberate attempts throughout history to deny that same wealth to Black people. So when you're shopping, how often are you seeking out Black businesses? How often are you spending your money on Black products? Things like that. And I'm not saying that every dime you spend has to be, but when I say people, I'm not just talking about white people. Right. I'm talking about Black people too. How often are you purposely trying to support Black businesses? That's become a recent thing for me, is that I've been selecting Black-owned businesses and products and trying them. And if I like them, I take 5 minutes to say so on social media, because it makes people pay attention and it makes them reconsider and think, oh, let me try that product over, a big name brand that is a conglomerate or whatever. And so little stuff like that is how we individually can impact policy or set policy. We talk a lot on social media about cancel culture and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I am a strong believer that it is a sense of boycott. If you're not doing something that supports my life, my ideals, my beliefs, I'm not going to spend my money with you. I'm not going to give my attention to you. I'm not going to give you my streams or my views or whatever it is that equates to success for you. And so I think all of those things are ways that we can indeed enact policy and change the narrative, change the way that this country views race in general.
But I want to point out, Melissa, how deliberate, right? Like what you were describing is being deliberate, and it very much lines up with Kennedy's definition around anti-racism, right? That day to day, you're knowingly or unknowingly, right, engaging in racist behavior unless you're intentionally not. So it's an interesting discernment, if you will. He does go on, by the way, and I'll put in really quickly, he does also define what we mean by racial equity and inequity. And of course, they're opposites of one another. Racial equity is when two or more racial groups are standing on approximately equal footing. Racial inequity, then, of course, is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. And he then, of course, says the flip side, that from the perspective of policy, racist policy is any measure that does produce or sustain racial inequity between groups. So I throw those out there into the conversation just to make sure that we're clear about those with our listeners as well. They mean a lot to me as an educator as well, because we're spending a lot of time on this notion of equity right now. But what I'm finding is it takes an awfully brave district or school leader or what have you to talk about equity in terms of race. And so creating the conditions where we can actually get people to talk about equity in terms of race is one of our challenges. Sorry, Henri, you were going to jump in.
Well, no, because as I'm listening to all this, it's how do you do that? And so part of it is, I'm having so many thoughts here. It's where do I find that group or that entity that I want to be engaged with and involved in? Because I agree with you, Melissa. On a personal level, I can certainly choose to buy Black. There is certainly, with the internet, lots of places you can go and find to do that. But if you want to take that to a broader level and get into the things we're talking about, policy and things that affect us in a much broader way, you can't do that alone. And it's finding where do I get involved? What group do I become a part of? I know when my kids were still in public school, I joined the citywide health and safety committee. And I felt that way I could be involved at a level that could have more of an influence just instead of just me. And so where the bravery, maybe not bravery, but where you really have to, must say, utilize that opportunity is in those discussions. Yes. And be willing to raise those questions. Oh, okay, as we're discussing policy acts and this funding going forward, can you explain to me how that's going to benefit all the kids in the school?
Yeah.
So as I'm saying, it's trying to find that place or that group that I can be engaged in, and then being willing to raise those kind of issues and questions, because that's the only way those things are going to happen.
Well, I think, Henri, that's so important, because I think, we're figuring this out ourselves too. And I think our listeners will agree we're being very transparent about that. But what I appreciate about the example that Melissa gave, and then the one you gave, is there are so many levels, right? And yes. So what I'm going to encourage people who are listening to consider is grab onto the level that is most accessible to you right now, and then aspire to the next level, right? Don't not grab on at all because you feel like the example we've provided is too far out of your reach for any number of reasons. I don't have the time, I don't have the book, whatever it is, right? We don't need to go into them, but grab on to the level that is within your reach, that you can, where you can begin to, I keep using the expression, start to be a part of the solution, if you will. So I love that you guys just both gave those examples. And I think we have to remind each other as we continue having these conversations about, when and you just did it organically, Henri, when one person offers an example at one level, offer an example at another level so that we can help meet people where they are. Go ahead, Melissa.
I just wanted to say also that the same applies for your level of understanding.
Yes.
Which is something that we came to in our planning discussion last week. The three of us are all in different places in our lives, in our experiences, in how we understand things and why we understand them the way we do. And so we may not see things the same way because we're not in the same place. We're not on the same level of understanding. That doesn't mean that we just throw up our hands and say, you know what, can't do this. So yeah. I'll never be where Henri is. Yes. That could have very easily been our conversation last week. Like, I can't get there. And I remember the conversation you and I had with a former classmate, Melvin Brown, where we were in two different places and we had two totally different understandings and ideas But instead of just saying, well, I'll never get to where Melvin is, or Melvin saying, well, I'll never, or I hope I never get to where Melissa is, we just had to come to the understanding that we are in different places. So this journey is going to be different for us, but the journey exists nonetheless. And I think that if listeners and we ourselves come into this with that in mind, then we'll eventually be able to progress to those levels that seem unattainable right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So I'm looking at time, and I think what I'm going to ask, if you guys are good with this, is that the final definition we land on is going to be this idea of discrimination, because it's a term we hear the expression racial discrimination all the time. And so I want to share really quickly with the listeners what Kendi says specifically about that term. And I'm looking at page 19 just as a point of reference, and then get your thinking around it, because he really does something really important with this word. So he transitions from the conversation around racist policy to racial discrimination. He says that racist policy cuts to the core of racism better than this idea of racial discrimination, which is a very common base, because he says racial discrimination is an immediate and visible manifestation of an underlying racial policy. When someone discriminates against a person in a racial group, they're carrying out a policy or taking advantage of the lack of a protective policy. We all then have the power to discriminate. Only an exclusive few, and you said this earlier, Melissa, have the power to actually make policy at high levels that we're talking about. So essentially what he argues is, let's focus on the word discrimination and take off the word racial. And he says specifically, focusing on racial discrimination actually serves to take our eyes off the central agents of racism, which is racial policy and racist policy makers, kind of like your point about the minimum wage conversation, Henri, or what he would call racist power. So interestingly enough, he's suggesting that by using racial discrimination, we're actually serving the purpose of taking our eye off all that stuff that's happening that actually really has significant impact on us. And that's we got to stop that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, say that again. That's interesting, because
I know there's so much in here, Henri, that it kind of sneaks up on you. But basically, he's saying, so he basically focuses on the word discrimination instead of racial discrimination. But he explains that because he says racial discrimination is an immediate and visible manifestation of an underlying racial policy, right?
Right.
And so we tend to get distracted by that instead of actually focusing on the policy that caused it. So to do that, let's not focus on that, and let's think about, discrimination in general, which leads to his next really big point, which is any of us can discriminate. And
and it comes back to, I think, something we may have said at the beginning, I know we talked about last week, is linguistics, semantics, because the way he's using the word discrimination, it's neither good nor bad. It's how it's being applied. So to discriminate in a way that's empowering for everybody is a good thing.
Exactly.
To discriminate in a way that somehow you have a better opportunity, Janice, than Melissa, is a bad thing.
Right.
So and I think it goes back to, even the word racist, we have attached so much to these words that just the words bring up so much, affirmative action. Quickly people think about, oh, that's discrimination, Well, yes, it is. But it's doing something in a positive way that hopefully levels out the playing field, in a sense. But just that word brings up so much emotion, and it's neither good nor bad. It's how it's applied.
That's exactly right. So I really like how you summarize that. That's exactly his point, Henri, that it's not good or bad, it's how it's applied. And I want to give our listeners a couple of specific ideas. He says that, and you said this, If discrimination is creating equity, then it's anti-racist. If it's creating equity, then it's anti-racist. If it's creating inequity, then it's racist. So discrimination can either be racist or anti-racist. And the example that he gets to, and I got to tell you, I had to read this section several times in order to understand what he was saying. But the example that he gets to is this idea of affirmative action. That if an affirmative action policy is in fact creating equity, then it is anti-racist, right? Because what it's simply doing is correcting policy that has, up until that point, and the data supports it, demonstrated that one racial group was preferred or given preferential access than over another, right? And I bring that out because I know that notion of affirmative action is a emotional, that term, to your point about linguistics, Henri, that elicits emotions in people. And I think the way he posits it is really important for us to understand that if the data shows, and you could even argue intentionally or not, right? I would argue intentionally, but let's assume the best, unintentionally, that the current policies have preferred one race over another, then it requires discrimination to fix that. And I think that's a really important concept for folks that we might have to dig into a little bit more in future conversations to really help unpack and what have you. He does.
Well,
go ahead, Ami.
no, and it's interesting you talk about the emotion, and I don't know if the two of you remember the case. I think it was a woman in Texas that literally challenged, started the challenge. So this whole notion of, oh my God, this is reverse discrimination. Affirmative action is actually discrimination against white people.
And so that's it. That's why this definition is so important, right? Like he's arguing it can't be discriminatory against white people unless white people were already being held, unless white people were already being held back and they weren't
harmed.
Exactly, or harmed. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So and this is probably a really inflammatory place to leave the conversation. So I'm going to put this out there, and then I'll get your responses, then come back and close us out, and we're going to pick up next time, and I'll talk about what we're going to do. But he in his argument really around this idea that by focusing on the expression of racist discrimination, we're actually fueling we're fueling an idea that really is designed to distract us from the policies, et cetera, that have created the conditions we're trying to argue about. And he says that the most threatening, this is really, really interesting, the most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's unlikely drive for a white ethno-state, but the regular Americans' drive for a race-neutral one. The construct of race neutrality actually feeds white nationalist victimhood by positing the notion that any policy protecting or advancing non-white Americans toward equity is reverse discrimination. So, Melissa, you're muted.
No, I know I was talking.
Oh, sorry, got it. No, you were looking this way, so I thought, yep, okay. But you know what? It's not an episode in the world of COVID if we don't say you're muted at some point. So there we go. We got it in.
Right.
So that's his argument, Henri, for what you were getting at with this idea of reverse discrimination, right? That it really is a deep-seated way, by putting that idea on the table, this idea of reverse discrimination, and suggesting that only race neutral prevents discrimination, we are in fact fueling discrimination against Blacks or people of color or what have you. And again, you have to really step by step with that one for him. And I had to read it several times. And then I thought, oh my gosh, no wonder this is complex and no wonder this is a struggle.
Well, think of this as, and maybe this is a stretch, if we put it in terms of gender, let's just think of men and women as the same. And in whatever encounters, medical, we don't have to discriminate in any way, shape, or form because we're all the same. And we know that's not true.
No, I love that. I love that you took it there because again, I think that part of our part of our work here is to, right, create the metaphors or the analogies or what have you that that allow all of us to access the learning. So, and to your point, Melissa, about kind of meeting us where we are and understanding there's a spectrum. Okay, any last thoughts on any of the things that we've talked about already? Because I know we're very much on the edge of leading toward the next episode where we're going to actually get into well, before I say all that, any thoughts on what we talked about already before I make the bridge for the next episode? Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, I just want to say, because I admitted even
You are, Melissa, hold on one second. You're really quiet for some reason.
Oh, let me see.
And I know you're going to say something genius, so I just can't allow it to be quiet.
Is this any better?
That's it. You got it.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. I took out my earphones. I would just say really that I think being a person who struggled with the definitions, and still struggle with them, I know that it's very easy to have this idea that we understand. Like, you couldn't have told me before that I didn't understand what the word racism, or that there was another way to view it. You couldn't have told me until now. So I just want to challenge everybody to challenge themselves. That's what overcoming this is going to take. Even though, like I said, it's so ingrained in us that we just think it's there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you're being super sensitive. You're just not, you're taking that the wrong way. Like, no, you have to challenge what you believe, what you think, what you feel. And even if you come back to believing what you believed, at least you did the work of considering and challenging and hearing and listening and learning, because that's what it's going to take. If we all just kind of dig our toes in because that's what we think, we're going to end up staying right where we dig our toes, and that's not what we want.
Yeah. Yep. Makes perfect sense. All right. So I'm going to bridge us this way, I think, because like I said, it'd be as we get more and more into this reading, we're gonna the ideas are gonna flow and kind of back and forth and what have you, and I want to make sure that we bridge them. So I think what hopefully what listeners are hearing right now is that this idea, this notion of racist ideas, right? So Kenny talks about the idea of the concept of a racist idea. And he says that racist ideas have defined our society since its beginning, and we can feel, and they can feel so natural and obvious as almost as to be banal, kind of like the water that I mentioned earlier. But anti-racist ideas remain difficult to comprehend, in part because they go against the flow of our history, right? The idea of being anti-racist goes against all the things we've been surrounded by our entire lives. He says we've been programmed to respond to the human difference between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways: ignore it, and if that's not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. So our intention here really is to disrupt that pattern and to create patterns for relating across our human difference as equals, right? That's what we're really trying to capture here. And I hope that's coming through for folks. So to do that next, we're going to move from these definitions. There are going to be other definitions along the way, obviously, and we're going to work hard to stop and make sure we're clear about them as we go. But we are going to head into episode 26, where we're going to pick up with actually three more really key definitions. The ideas of assimilationist, segregationist, and anti-racist. We talked a little bit about anti-racist today, but we're going to dig into it a little bit more, and how they all contribute to what Kendi describes as this idea of a dueling consciousness. There's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to work hard together to discover that. Again, this is part of the basis or the foundation of the learning that leads us then to be able to layer onto it kind of one chapter and one concept at a time as we continue. So that's going to be where we go from today. Looking forward to episode 26. We hope that we will hear from you with respect to your thoughts, your ideas, your comments. Of course, we hope that you will share both the YouTube channel and the link to this podcast to the folks in your life who you think would be ready to help engage in that struggle with you. This idea of building a community of strugglers who can learn alongside each other is important. We hope to be that with you, and certainly that you'll recruit others in your life to do the same. So join us again next week for episode 26, and we'll get to it.